Dr. Niam. So next up, we have our speaker, Kayte Spector Bagdady. Kayte is Health Law and Bioethics faculty at the University of Michigan Medical School, where she is also the Associate Director of the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine. Her research focuses on equitable governance of secondary research use of health data and biospecimens, and she is currently funded by NCI, and NCATS. Previously, Professor Spector was a practicing attorney for the biotech industry and was Associate Director of President Obama's Bioethics Commission. I can give you all a heads up that I've watched this and the following talk, and we've got an incredible discussion lined up for today. So looking forward to seeing folks' response. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kayte Spector Bagdady, and I am Health Law and Bioethics faculty at the University of Michigan Medical School, where I'm also Associate Director of our Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine. Today, I'm going to talk with you guys about enabling justice by increasing the demographic diversity in our reference data sets for machine learning, specifically racial and ethnic diversity. So first, I want to recognize my funders. Currently, I have K01 Awards for Career Development Award from NHGRI. I'm also a co-I on an R from NCI and a co-I on a U from NCATS. So I'm going to make 5 major points today, and we'll go over them right now so there won't be any surprises. First, biospecimens and health data that end up in machine learning reference data sets are governed by method of procurement. But what contributors care about, so what patients and research participants actually worry about, is use, not how data came into the system to begin with. But biospecimens and health data that were procured differently, so fall under different regulatory structures, are actually being used increasingly in similar ways. And regulatory mechanisms and market forces have thus far failed to reconcile the tension between what our participants actually want and what is legal for entities like industry or federally funded researchers to do. So then we're going to conclude by asking, what are the implications of this sort of gappy regulatory structure for the demographic diversity of machine learning reference data sets? So let's start with the first, that biospecimens and health data are governed by method of procurement. So some of you may or may not have this much background, but under the regulatory structure, data and specimens that come in through clinical care are generally governed under HIPAA, the privacy rule of HIPAA, right? And so we're allowed to share data in certain ways. There's a lot of limitations on sharing identified data. We're allowed to share more freely de-identified data under certain circumstances and third-party business associate agreements, and all of that stuff follows under clinical care and HIPAA. Then if we're talking about the research enterprise, we're actually talking about the common rule. So that's what generally governs federally funded researchers, as well as academic medical centers like the University of Michigan, who apply those rules broadly across all of its researchers. And that generally applies to some identified research, so research with identified data and specimens. And when we're talking about data that have been commercially procured, maybe FDA, maybe the Trade Commission, maybe the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid have something to do with it, but there are a lot of holes in governance. I'm just going to talk about a couple really briefly. So one, our current regulations only apply in limited circumstances. And generally, first of all, we're taking de-identified data and biospecimens completely off the table because almost nothing governs the use of de-identified data and specimens. And identified is by the definition under HIPAA. So one of the explicit 18 HIPAA identifiers. And when you have all of those off, data are considered de-identified, and almost no regulatory regime governs them. Another circumstance in which it applies is, so the human subjects research regulation, so the common rule, actually only applies in several circumstances, including when a researcher has federal funding, when a researcher is at an institution like the University of Michigan that applies the common rule across all of our researchers, no matter what. Or if you want, or if you're using a drug or a device that is currently regulated by FDA and you want to use it for experimental use in your research, you have to follow the FDA regs. Or if you want to submit your data in support of an FDA application, for example, in support of a new drug or device application, then you had to have followed FDA regulations, which are substantially similar to the common rule. And then last, as you probably know, there's this whole world of identified data and specimens that researchers can work with under a waiver of informed consent. And basically all a waiver of informed consent requires is that the IRB determines that the research that's proposed is generally low risk and that there's no real practical way to go back and get consent from all the patients or participants. So under these circumstances, many participants and a whole lot of patients don't even realize that sometimes their even identified data and specimens are ending up in these research databanks and having a lot of different kinds of uses. The other thing I want to highlight is that the human subjects research regulations in particular were written in response to, directly in response to the Tuskegee syphilis study, and in response to kinds of studies where harms were very individual and risks were physical and quite profound. However, we're largely, when we're talking about the secondary research use of data and specimens, we're talking about different kinds of harms, right? So generally speaking, like perhaps when we apply these in algorithmic and machine learning technologies, we might be talking about physical harms, but I'll defer that to my colleague who's coming after me to talk about that kind of stuff. But, you know, if I'm using somebody's secondary data for my research, somebody doesn't risk any physical harm. The kinds of harms people risk are different. We call them in law dignitary harms. So something like a privacy breach. We sometimes call them non-welfare interests, right? So a non-welfare interest would be something like, I don't want my data used in support of research that will create better weapons of mass destruction. So, you know, I have this sort of, it doesn't actually affect me. It's not going to hurt me. It's not going to hurt me financially, but that's not something I value. So I don't want to contribute to that. Or algorithmic biases, which we're going to talk about a little later as well. So the second point is, despite the fact that our entire regulatory structure governs by method of procurement, what our patients and participants actually care about is use. So a couple of examples. So this is where DeVries et al. Coined the term sort of non-welfare interest in research. And they did a really interesting study where they asked a group of people whether they would be willing to consent to a broad consent for secondary research use of their data and specimens. So signing one of those documents that says, yes, you can do whatever you want with my data and specimens after the primary research is done with it. And they found that about 70% of their researchers said, sure, that sounds fine. You can do whatever you want in the future. Like, I'm willing to contribute to research. But then when they went back to those same participants and said, hey, you said we could do whatever we wanted, but what if we want to do research on weapons of mass destruction? What if we want to do research on ways to improve abortion? What if we want to do research on, you know, splicing humans and animals and chimera research? What if we want to do those things? And 70% of people actually changed their mind and said, oh no, that actually wasn't what I was talking about. I want to revoke my consent. And we also know that people have very explicit concerns about commercialization, which is when data or specimens are brought in by either an NGO or sort of an academic medical center, and then end up getting sold or shared for some other kind of remuneration with private industry. And that really makes people uncomfortable. People want to know about it. You know, almost 70% in our sample said that they want to know if that's happening. And then almost 80% said, and when you tell me that that's happening, I am going to be uncomfortable. So the third point that I want to make is that biospecimens and health data that are procured differently, so procured under different regulatory structures, end up getting used in quite similar ways. And again, we know that use is what patients and participants are really concerned about. So just a couple examples. This is a piece we had in Science a couple of years ago, but this was about this sort of whole privatized industry that's popping up, that's recreating health records on the basis of freely available health proxy and health data on the internet, right? And so under HIPAA, an academic medical center can't just start sharing your identified medical information for research with other entities for profit. However, if you start a new company and the business model is that you data mine through people's, social media presence or any Fitbit, any sort of data output, and you're looking for specific health and health proxy data, like, for example, whether you travel to see a psychiatrist every Wednesday, that would, if your GPS data shows that, that would be health proxy data that would be of interest to people trying to recompile medical records. And then when that happens, if they sell access to researchers, that's completely outside the auspices of any of our current health privacy protections, right? HIPAA doesn't apply because it's not originally clinically derived data, and the common rule doesn't apply because it's not originally human subject research derived data. This is completely outside the auspices, yet being then used for research. This is another example where we looked at academic researchers increasing use of private genetic data sets for their academic research. And you can see there's sort of 3 lines on the graph there. The top one is increasing publications using private genetic data sources. The bottom line is industry authors publishing in the peer-reviewed literature. And the middle line, you can see the middle line, the line that's driving up that curve, is actually academics increasingly using private genetic data sets for their academic work. So there's a lot of mixing. Academics are using data that they might not otherwise be allowed to bring in themselves through their patients or their research, and they're using it from private entities. They're buying it or they're asking for access from private entities. So there's a lot of mixing. And I'll use the University of Michigan here as an example because they love it when I do that. But this is the excerpt from our clinical consent form that says basically, so any patient who comes in for surgery or any sort of tissue or blood removal says, University of Michigan can use my clinically derived data and specimens for really anything that's legally allowable. However, because there are more regulations and more disclosure requirements by the common rule on our research side, our research consents, this is just a small excerpt of a big section on different things that we might do with people's data and specimens moving forward. So there's a lot of contrast between the kinds of information that we're sharing with our patients versus our participants regarding secondary use, when we know that they all go into the same EMR system and often they can be used for the same kinds of research. And I'm not just trying to pick on the University of Michigan. This is true nationally with many hospitals. Hospitals who align these consent forms are the rarity. And, so that's an additional challenge, that even within the same hospital system, we can get different levels of consent and share different levels of disclosure with people on the basis of them coming in either as a patient or a participant. So 4, and I talked a little bit about this in the first point, is our current regulatory structure as well as, market forces have not reconciled this tension between what patients and participants are comfortable with when we use their data versus what we can actually legally get away with. And I'll just use one, so there are tons of examples, but I'll use one that I think might be of particular interest to this audience, which is the recent Interstein versus Google and the University of Chicago case. And in this case, the University of Chicago entered into an agreement with Google that they would share de-identified patient medical record information in exchange for a non-exclusive licensing agreement to any future machine learning models. So that was the data use agreement between the two entities. Mr. Dinerstein, who was a patient at the University of Chicago, was not comfortable with that arrangement and tried to sue both Google and University of Chicago. It's a complicated case. There's a lot of reasons why it didn't work out. But one thing I will highlight is that when you sue for a breach of contract, or he brought a bunch of different kinds of claims, but at the end of the day, usually you actually have to demonstrate that you were injured by what occurred. And that was a standard Mr. Dinerstein could not meet because he couldn't prove that he had any property interest in his electronic medical record data that was shared. And even if he did have a property interest in that EMR data, just because it was shared to Google didn't make it less valuable. And so the court said, well, we can't even hear this case because we have nothing to litigate because you had no injury. So that was dismissed. And I use it as an example that I think it's going to be really hard for individual patients to have any sort of private right of action against the system as it moves along. So there are going to have to be other forces that rectify this, if it's going to be rectified at all. And let me talk a little bit about, so what are the implications of this system, right? Because this talk is focused on, demographic diversity implications. So, this is a problem for all sorts of patients and participants that don't agree with this system and a lack of protections. But why is it problematic for both demographic diversity and racial and ethnic diversity in our reference data sets in particular? So I think that this is actually something that is pretty widely known. If you don't know that reference data sets are more likely to reflect information regarding wealthy white patients, I suggest you read Casey Ross and Stat News more often. This is a pretty common problem among our machine learning reference data sets. But the thing that I want to add is that, no two data sets are created equal, and no two disparities are either. And there's actually several different specific ways that we're building racial and ethnic biases into our reference data sets. So let me highlight a few of them. So one is, and again, I hope that we all know this, and in particular, the COVID crisis has really brought this into stark relief, is the incredible racial and ethnic disparities in access to clinical care and diagnostic testing in this country, right? If certain communities are less likely to either physically have access to a clinic or a hospital, or be able to afford healthcare, or to be able to afford diagnostic testing, they're much less likely to end up in our system to begin with. And this is particularly exacerbated by the kinds of large, wealthy academic medical centers who can feed into these machine learning databases. Because often the kinds of academic medical centers that have the technological capacity and the interest in entering into those kinds of partnerships are located in largely white, wealthy communities. Second, and this I think is not always self-evident to people, but in addition to disparities in access to care and diagnostic testing, there are also a lot of differences in the kinds of participants that are recruited for research to begin with. There's been some interesting deliberative research done with Black and African American communities specifically, on why that community is less likely to enroll in research. And by and large, the answer is, well, no one has asked me to enroll in research. And this is data that are under review, but we actually looked at an academic medical center, and we sort of looked not at the consent rate, but at the recruitment design, right? So how people are being recruited actually can also affect race and ethnicity of the cohort, even more than it already is being affected by the kinds of people who can afford and have access to be there in the first place, right? So we're increasing the disparity by our methods of recruitment. And this doesn't necessarily have to be nefarious. It doesn't necessarily have to be that our study coordinators are less likely to approach, an African-American man than they are to approach an older white woman, although I'm sure that plays out in a lot of circumstances. But it can also just be the way we designed recruitment protocols. For example, are you recruiting in surgery pre-op? If you are much more likely to get people who, potentially have serious medical issues, who definitely have insurance, and who are willing to sit around and chat with study coordinators. So the method of recruitment is really important. And then we also know, and this is sort of more common knowledge, but a lot of what my research has focused on too, is that there's also differences in types of participants that consent to research, or hypothetically say they would or would not feel comfortable with different kinds of research. So in the 2017 research here by Reshma Jaxi et al., they found that a substantial minority felt it was necessary to obtain specific consent for research, even for secondary research. But that raised the level of about half of her Black and Hispanic participants thought that was true. We also know from our own research that when asked in our cohort recently that we analyzed, Black, Asian, and Hispanic Latino patients were twice as likely to decline enrollment if asked compared to white patients. And then also we found that in a different study cohort, Black and Hispanic respondents were less likely to report comfort with academic or commercial research use of their data or specimens, right? So this is 3 different layers of points at which we skew the racial and ethnic demographics of our reference data sets. So first of all, certain communities are less likely to have access to care from which we derive those data sets in the first place. Second of all, when we're actually trying to draw people into research specifically, we are more likely to design protocols that recruit wealthy white participants. And then last, because of the ways that major academic medical centers and researchers have acted in the past, certain communities are less likely to consent to enroll in research. And this has a lot of impact in many different ways. And I only have a couple more minutes, so I'm not going to dive too deeply into it. But one is we need to know that homogeneous cohorts can skew research agendas. So for example, I just finished interviewing a bunch of academic genetic researchers, and one of my questions was why everyone's data focused on European communities, and the answer was, well, those are the data we have. Like if I want to publish in high impact journals, I have to have statistically significant findings, and I can only do that among Europeans. It can also lead to misdiagnoses or unknown diagnosis for historically excluded communities. But note that in these cases, we're talking about genetics. So we're talking about ancestral diversity, which is important but different than racial and ethnic diversity, because racial and ethnic diversity might or might not be related to ancestral diversity. So it's important to keep those 2 concepts separate. And then, this is important for both Black and African American communities as well as white communities when we're looking at contrast specifically, because the majority of genetic ancestral diversity is actually in those of African American descent. And so it helps everybody when we have diverse ancestral diversity represented in our databanks, in genetics in particular. So I'm not going to be able to solve this in the talk. My goal was to sort of highlight, but I think we should know that this problem is very unlikely to have a regulatory fix anytime soon. We just redid our human subjects research regulations, and we didn't fix it. And it took us 20 or 30 years to redo it in the first place. It's probably not going to redo it anytime soon. And so really the pressure will be on academic medical centers, industry, and journals that are accepting the peer-reviewed publications of these and putting them out there to set higher standards for this field moving forward. And in particular, that New England Journal article is an example of one of the things that we've been trying to do at the University of Michigan, which has sort of a humble focus of just focusing on the commercialization of our data and specimens to begin with, and ensuring that different kinds of disclosure and informed consent was acquired before at least commercializing our data and specimens. So with that, I am going to conclude. If any of you guys are interested in sort of a way deeper dive into sort of the regulatory and legal structures at play here, I just had a recent piece published in the Journal of Law and the Biosciences, which you might find interesting. But sort of in conclusion, I want you to walk away from my talk with, you probably knew that our reference data sets were already horrifically racial and ethnically biased. And my colleague after me is going to talk about the impact of some of those things. But I hope you gained sort of a more nuanced understanding on the different ways that we can build biases into those data sets to begin with, including access to care, ways we recruit, and then ways we get informed consent. Thank you very much.